The story Lamp at Noon by Sinclair Ross revolves around a husband and wife, Ellen and Paul, as well as their child. Paul, the husband, works as a farmer. Therefore, they live on a farm, and they rely on the crop as a source of income as well as a source of food. However, the crops aren't growing in the constant desert-like conditions and windstorms that are going on in their area. So Ellen, Paul's wife, expresses her concern about the fact that the crops aren't growing, as well as the dust affecting the baby's breathing and health. Also, that it will dry out the crops to a point of no return, leaving them with no source of income or food. Paul, however, is so proud that he's convinced that he can salvage the crops and is completely against the idea of moving elsewhere. Ellen and Paul's marriage is hanging on by a string as Paul continues to be small-minded and gets frustrated with Ellen's constant need for more, and Ellen, on the other hand, is getting more and more frustrated with Paul's small-mindedness. The story has a tragic ending in which Paul goes to his barn and he realizes how malnourished and unhealthy his horses look and thinks that Ellen might be right, so he goes into the house to go and talk to Ellen. However, Ellen is gone, and so is the baby. After a little bit of searching, he finds Ellen with the baby. However, the baby is dead, but the storm is over. Sinclair Ross was born in 1908 on January 22nd in Saskatoon and was one of Canada's most respected writers. He was raised by his mother and spent most of his life working as a banker and just writing in his free time. Most of his stories took place in Canadian prairies, just like The Lamp at Noon, and also contained themes of intellectual isolation. I believe that the story revolves around Paul's small-mindedness and pride that cost him the life of his own child. I believe that Paul was very insecure about Ellen's previous wealth and feels that he's not doing enough to support his family and that he needs to prove it to himself, so he can't admit that Ellen is right to want more for them and their child. He was too proud to accept a job from her father, even though it would be greatly beneficial to their family and lifestyle. Their relationship only worsens as the story continues, as well as Paul's willingness to listen. This demonstrates the importance of empathy and communication in any personal relationship, as well as the dangers of insecurity and pride when you let it take over. The quote, "I can't stand it any longer. He cries all the time. You will go, Paul. Say you will. We aren't living here. Not really living." This demonstrates that Ellen has made several attempts to try and get Paul to understand how she's feeling, yet Paul dismisses her each time. If Paul would have simply put himself into Ellen's shoes and empathized, he would have understood how difficult the lifestyle was on her as a new mother. Instead, his judgment was clouded by his pride. The story uses themes and symbolism. I think a strong theme that is portrayed throughout the story is pride and ignorance. Paul let his pride and ignorance cloud his judgment and feels that he needs to provide for his family without accepting any help from others, most importantly, Ellen's father. The quote, "I can't go, Ellen, living off your people. Charity, stop and think of it. This is where I belong. I can't do anything else." This quote clearly illustrates Paul's resistance to accept any help due to his pride and ignorance. I can connect this to myself, even though I think I'm a little more sensible than Paul. I do admit that if I have a strong opinion on something and I'm proven wrong, it is difficult to admit defeat. It's almost more fear of embarrassment. Although I'm not justifying Paul's stupidity, I do understand where his feelings came from, seeing as he had the confidence in his farming to take Ellen away from her lifestyle and everything she knew and raise a child with her, but in the end, everything ended up being his fault. I also think that the storm is a symbol for the way Paul is feeling throughout the story. In the beginning of the story, he's so angry and frustrated with himself and with Ellen that the storm just continues to grow bigger and bigger and causing more problems, just like his attitude was. And throughout the story, he continues to be headstrong until the end of the story, where he finally comes to his senses and realizes that Ellen is right, and then the storm is over, just like his attitude towards the whole situation during the story. In the end, it took the death of his own child for Paul to really open his eyes. I personally enjoyed the story because I think it really highlights on the danger and the consequences of pride and ignorance, even though sometimes they can seem like such an innocent thing. But really, in their extreme, they can be very dangerous. And I also thought the end was very shocking, but I think that Sinclair Ross had a good way of making you feel sympathy for Paul, even though he had done so much wrong throughout the story. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the story.